My name is Dennis Samut. I'm the director of Links Europe, a peace-building organization based in The Hague, in the Netherlands. For the last 30 years, I have traveled across the post-Soviet space and was close to many of the events and developments that impacted this vast region. In this series of video diaries, I will revisit some of the key issues that have dominated the region, and I will share some of my personal recollections and experiences. As recent developments in Ukraine have shown, much of what has happened in the past 30 years still has consequences in the present reality for people living in Europe and beyond. I want to talk a little bit about Abkhazia and South Ossetia. First of all, because one of the main reasons why I turned up in Georgia in 1992 was to try to understand what these conflicts that had started there were about, and whether there was any prospect or any way in which one could help to resolve them. And I remember going to Sukhumi in 1992. Sukhumi had already been lost and regained by the Georgians, so when I arrived in Sukhumi it was at that point in the hands of the Georgians. But we were taken to the north of Abkhazia, where negotiations were taking place between the Abkhaz and the Georgians. And this is very interesting because we now are used to the idea that the Georgians and the Abkhaz, the Georgians and the Ossetians can only discuss with a lot of international mediation and a lot of support from outside sources. Well, I saw with my eyes Georgians and Abkhaz in 1992 trying to negotiate a ceasefire and trying to see whether there was a way out of the impasse that was developing. And it was interesting for me to see that these talks could take place in a way that there was no outside involvement. Of course, things became much more complicated later on. We were one of the first organizations to get involved in the South Ossetian situation. So in 1994, I went to Tskin Valley, had some discussions there with the people who were in charge, and we felt that it was possible to initiate some kind of track to diplomacy to renew contacts between Tskin Valley and Tbilisi. This was a point where the contacts were broken completely, where the Ossetians refused to come to Tbilisi for any kind of discussion and negotiations. So after a lot of negotiations, we eventually persuaded the Ossetians that they can come to Georgia, but they didn't want to come to Tbilisi, so we agreed that they will come to Batumi. Now, Batumi is the capital of Adjara, another region of Georgia, that at this time was also not so much under the control of the central government in Tbilisi, but it was led by someone called Aslan Abashidze, and Abashidze was someone who was quite close to the Russians. There was a Russian base in Adjara, and somehow the Russians provided him protection. But Abashidze was also in a very odd way, very staunchly Georgian. So you had someone who was very pro-Russian, but on the other hand, very staunchly Georgian. And in 1995, when we were talking with the Ossetians, and the Ossetians said they don't want to come to Tbilisi, but they are ready to go to Batumi. So I asked Zohar Zhwania whether he could introduce me to Aslan Abashidze. And Zhwania said, I'm going to Batumi next week, come with me. So I went when we went to Batumi. And of course, there were the discussions between Zhwania and Abashidze. I don't speak Georgian, so I don't know what they talked about. But then sort of Zhwania said, well, we've got our guests here from Britain, and maybe they have something to say to you. And that is the point where I asked Abashidze, can we have these negotiations in Batumi? And he said yes. He said, I will do whatever I can. And to be fair, he did. So in July, we had this big event in Batumi in July 1995, to which we invited an Ossetian delegation and also some Abkhaz MPs, and they came. And Abashidze organized in the evening a big party with Caucasian dancing and so on, and that opened a channel of communication, not necessarily with the Abkhaz, but with the Ossetians. That opened a channel of communication between Tbilisi and Skenvali that eventually developed into something a little bit more sophisticated and helped to diffuse a lot of the tensions in the late 1990s and helped to open up the contacts. Because if you see, the situation was in this period between, say, 1997 and 2003 better than it has been at any point in the last 30 years. You could go to Skenvali without any checkpoints at some point. You could come to Tbilisi, they could come to Tbilisi without the movement of people was completely open. And I can say that we contributed to this. I'm not saying that we were the only people. There were others, the OSCE and there were others. But we were there and we contributed substantially to this because there were not so many actors around at the time. This human contact in the Caucasus is hugely important. You can talk about politics and you can talk about a lot of political models, constitutional models. In the end, what really matters are the personal contacts. So the absence of physical contacts between Abkhaz and between Georgians and Ossetians today, for example, after the 2008 war, is one of the negative things that has happened. I already mentioned that 5 personalities, somehow larger than life, have dominated Georgian politics and public life for the last 30 or more years. Edward Shevardnadze is now dead. He was already quite old when he came back to lead Georgia as president of an independent Georgia in the 1990s. I met him in 2009 when I was a member of the Tagliavini Commission that was investigating the Georgia-Russia war. And it was an interesting meeting because it allowed Shevardnadze to sort of look back at the past, and I think he enjoyed doing that. He was telling jokes about Yeltsin in the sort of humor that Shevardnadze was known for. So in a sense, he has already gone and passed into history, and I think that in the future Georgians will have to think about what was his exact role in the process of establishing the independence of their country in very difficult moments. Zurab Zhwania died in 2005 when he was prime minister in rather mysterious circumstances. It was a big loss for Georgia because Zhwania, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the people who actually had a vision of what and how Georgia could make the transition from the very difficult moments that it was in into a proper European state. Mikhail Saakashvili was president until 2013, then went into exile, and a couple of years ago he decided to return to Georgia despite the fact that there was an arrest warrant against him. And he has since been in prison in Georgia and remains a controversial character, seen in very bad light by many people, including people in the government, but also seen as very much a savior by another part of the population that actually thinks that it was during his leadership that Georgia was a truly independent and free country. Patriarch Ilya II is still alive. He's still the leader of the Orthodox Church, very frail now, very old, but still wielding a lot of influence as a spiritual leader. Big discussions about where the Orthodox Church will go when Ilya II dies and there has to be the transition to a new patriarch. So this is one of the challenges that lies ahead. Unfortunately, the Orthodox Church has become embroiled in many controversies, including some political controversies, and this means this transition is not going to be simple and will have some complications. Bidzina Ivanishvili is officially today a private person in Georgia, but he still wields huge influence on government. It's his political party that is in power. A lot of the people who are in government are people that he has appointed. So he remains very much relevant to the present Georgian political agenda. So are these the only 5 people that matter? Well, of course not. There were many others. One of the first things that I was involved in when I came to Georgia in the 1990s was to actually engage with young political leaders and leaders of young civil society organizations. Today in Georgia there are thousands of organizations, there are hundreds of events going on every year, there are a lot of foreign support for different initiatives, etc. In the 1990s there was hardly any, so we were quite a unique initiative. And the situation was not very conducive to organizing anything. So when in 1995 I wanted to organize the first big event with 100 young leaders of Georgian youth organizations, everybody told me, but where? There was one hotel that possibly could do it, the Metehi, but this hotel was under the control of the Hedvioni, which was a paramilitary semi-criminal organization, and so foreign embassies and foreign institutions were generally trying to avoid having contacts with this hotel at the time. So somebody told me there is a place in Tabahmela, which was a school of the Communist Party. So the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had a lot of buildings all over the Soviet Union, including party schools. And there was a party school in Tabahmela, which had conference facilities. So we decided to go there, and we realized that this facility was there, and miraculously, whilst most other places had been completely looted, this place in Tabahmela had been somehow kept intact. So after a lot of negotiations with the person who was in charge, who must have been a leftover from the Soviet period, somebody had forgotten about him there, it was agreed that we will hold this event in Tabahmela. So this was the first civil society event supported by the European Union, supposedly to promote new values of democracy and human rights and equality. There was a little snag though. This was a party school. So everywhere you looked in this building, there were quotations from Marx and Lenin. And for a moment I thought, what shall we do? Shall we try to cover these quotations from Marx and Lenin? But then I realized that this would have been counterproductive. So I told my colleagues, look, let's be comfortable sitting in this hall despite the quotations of Marx and Lenin, and we will be providing a counter message, and that would be our contribution to this conversation at the time. And it was an amazing event. 100 young leaders, many of them are still around in different political parties and in different parts of society in Georgia. But it was the first event of its kind that took place in Georgia. As I said, after that, hundreds, thousands probably, of seminars, workshops, conferences have taken place in the country. But we can say we were there the first. The issue of Georgia's place in the world has always been central to the conversation in this country. I want to try to unpack this a little bit because there are a lot of misconceptions, especially in Europe, about Georgia's Europeanness. So first of all, if you ask Georgians, and I'm not saying just simply people in Tbilisi, even if you go to a small village somewhere in the countryside, people will say, we are European. That does not mean that they are aware of the European Union or what the European Union is or what the European Union stands for. The Europeanness that they are associating with is more cultural, it's more civilizational. It's the Europe of Christianity, it's the Europe of culture and languages. This is something the Georgians feel an affinity with. And so every Georgian that you speak to will say, we are very strongly European. Some diplomats get confused when they try to translate this into Georgia's support for, say, European Union membership. I think that there is a gap that needs to be bridged to turn this Georgian Europeanness from being simply an affinity with a civilization to an affinity to a political project. And this is where I think the discussion is at the moment. So Georgia has been given a European Union membership perspective, but it has not been given a European Union candidate status yet. And this is the big debate that currently dominates Georgian politics. All political parties, government, opposition, all political parties that I know say that the EU should give Georgia a membership perspective. So, in a sense, even amongst the political elite, there is a certain consensus about the way forward. But on the other hand, there are also things that politicians say that contradict this ambition. These things are, these statements come both from, mainly from government sources these days, but also from some opposition forces, and also sometimes from some of the opposition forces that are mostly for Western. And there are these contradictions that the Georgian political elite has not yet managed to handle, of how to translate this desire for Europeanness to actually a desire to be part of the Europe that exists today, not in the dream of some memory of the past, that exists today with all the values that underpin this project, with all the values that underpin the European Union as an institution. The European Union is a very diverse institution, but on the other hand, there are values that unite all the countries that underpin the existence of the Union. So this is a contradiction in Georgian thinking and in Georgian political strategy that goes very deep. This is not just a question of a problem of one person or of one political party. This is something that, to be addressed, needs a bigger effort on the part of a lot of actors in Georgia and also with the support of others from outside. I believe that, yes, Georgia's future is with Europe. I believe that Georgia would benefit a lot if it is part of the European project, but there are also, there will have to be compromises that will have to be made in order to approximate the different positions. And this is not approximation only of law. In some countries that wanted to join the European Union, the task was to approximate the laws. So you had the process of the acquis communautaire, thousands of pieces of legislation that had to be incorporated into the local legislation. The Georgians have started doing this actually as part of their arrangement under the association agreement, and they're doing very well. So the problem is not with the laws. The problem is more substantial. It's with the thinking, with the mentality, and with the philosophy of the values that underpin society. I don't really believe that there are these huge contradictions. It's impossible to reconcile these views. Some years ago, I had a very interesting conversation with some leaders from the Orthodox Church, some bishops at the new University of Georgia in Porti. And it was very illuminating for me that first of all, you could have this kind of conversation on very sensitive issues, and that I felt that actually when you boil it down, the differences are not such that they cannot be reconciled. So I think what we are looking for the future is a Georgia that is on its way to EU membership, but also a conversation, a big national conversation about what this really means, what is the reality of EU membership, both in political and economic terms, but also in social terms, because this is sometimes raised that Georgia's values are different from the values of Europe. I don't believe that at all. I just believe that there is a lot of disinformation going around, partly initiated for political reasons, partly initiated by the Russians, and partly the result of simply ignorance. So people don't know, and so because they don't know, they speculate. So work has to be done in this regard. Once Georgia moves towards Europe, the big challenge will always remain how to manage Russia. Russia is a neighbor, a very large neighbor, and very often a very unfriendly neighbor to Georgia. So amongst Georgians, there is a love-hate relationship with Russia. On the one hand, many Georgians have Russian friends, many Georgians have been to Russia, many Georgians have spent years in Russia and made money there and came back. On the other hand, many Georgians see Russia as being a force that has been negative for the country, that has eroded the country's national identity, that has threatened its existence, that has waged war with it in 2008. And so obviously these are contradictions that keep appearing when Russia is discussed. A friend of mine in the early years gave me a piece of advice. He told me, when you look at Georgia, if something is wrong, blame the Russians. And the chances are that you will be right. But I think a much more sophisticated approach is needed. The Russians can be blamed for a lot of things that went bad in Georgia, but obviously they cannot be blamed for everything, and sometimes the problems are closer at hand. So a more realistic relationship with Russia is, I think, something that Georgia needs, and this has to be based on reality, but it also has to take into account the fact that Russia has been a hostile neighbor on many occasions, that Russia continues to support the secession of forces in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, thus obstructing the possibility of reconciliation, which is what I think everybody in the end really wants. And that is something that will need to be kept in mind. And I don't think there will be a normalization of relations between Georgia and Russia. There may be some positive steps here and there, but I don't think normalization is possible until the issue of Abkhazia and South Ossetia is somehow resolved. The problem is still there, and it is still an open wound. There are still a lot of people who have been displaced from Abkhazia and South Ossetia, now living in Tbilisi and other parts of Georgia, for who this is a very important issue. So any government that wants to reconcile with Russia has to somehow square the circle, because otherwise it will not be able to deliver what it wants. So for Georgia, the future has interesting perspectives. The country is in a very important geostrategic location, with connecting the countries of Central Asia with the countries of Europe. It has become an important energy hub, particularly, and energy transit country, particularly since the construction of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. Now, with the Central Asian republics trying to find alternative ways of communication, including transport communication with the world that bypass Russia, Georgia again becomes very important, because trans-Caspian connections can take the Central Asians up to Baku, but then if they want to move on to Europe, they generally have to go via Georgia. And so Georgia's importance as a geostrategic player remains huge, and I think this will continue to reflect itself in how things play out in the international arena. For me personally, these years, more than 3 decades of engagement with Georgia have been a very important part of my life, frankly. And I came here, I always say to people, nearly by accident, because initially I was not focused on this part of the world at all, but I think that the experience of having engaged with Georgia as it emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union into an independent state, and its journey over the last 3 decades to take its place amongst the community of nations, it's been an experience that I cherish. I appreciate that I have had the opportunity to accompany the country and the nation on this journey, and I look forward to the future with optimism, because I still think that despite all the difficulties, Georgia has a very bright future, I'm very optimistic about Georgia's future, not least because when I see young Georgians, I see their talents, I see their motivation. I'm convinced that these people will give their country a better future.